So while we're discussing the Western theater of the war, you can't discuss the West without discussing Grant, and we can't really truly understand Grant without understanding the important people surrounding him. I'm talking with Colonel Ely Parker, one of the more unique and interesting figures in the American Civil War. Take us through who is Ely Parker and why is he a man torn between two worlds?
Well, to start, when I was fairly young, I went with my parents to one of the local forts in Buffalo, New York. And as we were passing the gate, I heard these two soldiers kind of talking amongst each other, and I overheard that they were exclaiming about my broken English, because I was speaking to my parents and I could not speak English clearly. And as a native, why should I be expected to speak English clearly? But it had such an impact on me that I just had this drive to learn better and kind of prove myself to the world, to the white world, in fact, of that a native can do the same job that any other man can.
Now bring us through the Seneca Nation and where they are in terms of indigenous life versus Western life and how that played into your life.
Well, the Seneca Iroquois are on the western side of New York, and in terms of how we are with the world around us, as we consider the white world, we are fairly progressive. We understand that the white world is a fairly dominating world and that we have to accept them. So, in accepting them, we have also accepted the religion. The first school that I went to was a Catholic school, and I had to learn about Christianity through that, and also learning, in fact, how my religion also matches similarly to the Christian religion, which doesn't make it that much more difficult than any other member in our tribe. So, as far as accepting what we'd called the Western world, isn't too much of a difference or too far of a stretch for most of our people to accept them and to even become part of this Western world, this Western emphasis.
So educated, you had multiple different schools you went to. There was the what was the academy?
The Cayuga Academy.
The Cayuga Academy, and you developed this reputation as a not only an English speaker but a pretty competent writer.
Yes. While I was at the Cayuga Academy, I had enveloped myself a lot with the debates and had been very influential with the debates, as even so that was written in the newspaper that people were coming from all over New York coming to see the great natives speak in clear English against some of the other white students that were there. And as a native, I'm one of the very few dark-skinned members of my class and of the school entire, which does present a larger challenges. I did get in multiple fights as I was there, but in result, I held my own, and even so held my own as a wonderful debater. And that's where I got to practice even more, both learning about the Constitution, legalities, and then also how to present myself, how to be a great speaker, how to use and choose words to impact in different ways.
And you used that to help the Seneca, did you not?
Yes, it first started actually even younger than that, when I was about 14 years old, helping my local chiefs to convey their pleas to Washington. I even had gone to Washington, D.C., the District of Columbia, and had explained to the members of the pleas of of our chiefs and of the other members of the tribe, because we were facing almost entire annihilation of what we had called home.
Now you were actually given the title Grand Sachem.
Yes.
What does that mean, and how did it affect your life?
Traditionally, Grand Sachem was a member of the meetings in which the Seneca had, and across the Iroquois Confederacy. The term that had entered for my time, back in 1850, is the term that came along with my new name, which was Donehongoa. that name meaning keeper of the western door. And since I was at the very forefront of being part of the white world as much as being part of my own world, the native world, I was very much a guard or a gateway between my world, the native world, and this new white world that we are still trying to explore and learn about.
Now, eventually, you moved from New York to Galena, Illinois, and that's where you and I first developed a
Yes.
relationship between Rollins and Parker as lawyer in Galena, and then you were actually a civil engineer.
Yes, and in fact, I was planning to be a lawyer, but in fact, because I am a native, unfortunately, the Constitution nor does any of the other legalities confer that I am a citizen of the United States, which means I couldn't take the bar exam. And unfortunately, with that failure, I moved on to the next best thing, which for me was engineering. My mathematics skills and surveying skills uh, aided myself in learning how to become a better engineer, first working on the Cattaraugus and Allegheny Canals in New York, and then moving to Galena, where I built one of the first common houses, which I believe should still be standing by the end of this time. And when we meet, I also meet one of the other gentlemen along with that, which was
Our good friend.
which is now the General Grant.
Now, you overcame that huge obstacle to advancing in a career in the Western world. Um, but when the war broke out, you also wanted to participate in the Civil War, and there were huge roadblocks there. Go take us through those.
Yes. So in 1861, when the war broke out, I wanted to follow Grant, and because he was already recruiting members and immediately had been put into service, I wanted to follow with. But first, knowing my own traditions, had to go and ask my father for permission. He took a minute to consider it and then came back to me and said I should go because to follow Grant was to follow a great war captain. And if I were to follow him, I too would become a great war captain. So I got his confirmation, but first, meeting my first roadblock in New York, where I asked and plea my case saying that I was a civil engineer, had been called the rank of captain, but initially denied because of my race. And then feeling the first pressure there, wanted to go to Washington and coming into contact with Secretary Seward, who said the same thing, saying that this is a white man's war, that there is no need for native assistance, that I should go back and cultivate my farm and let the white man handle it.
And we know it's a complex issue. There were many natives that served in various capacities, but directly from Seward, they were opposed to you having a commission. But you do eventually get that commission, and you serve in the Corps of Engineers before coming on the staff. And we're going to save most of those anecdotes about the Civil War because there are some really interesting stories about your service during the Civil War. But I want to take off our personas for a second, and instead of John and Ely, it's going to be Max and Darrell because this has been such an interesting journey, and I'm so glad that I was able to share that with you because you too are a man stuck between two worlds.
Yes, my own personal heritage belongs to the Serrano Cahuilla, which is a part of the Morongo Band of Mission Indians in Southern California. And with what I've learned from my great-grandmother to my grandfather to my own mother, it's always been a part of my younger growing up, learning about Native American heritage, but also not understanding the difference between a white or Western type of world compared to what I had learned as a descendant of Native Americans. And it's a pretty big eye opener to understand the differences and the comparisons really between both our own tribes within the different locations across the U.S. and also between the Western world, which is a nicer term to kind of say about the white world because it's no longer just purely white. It is more of a westernized world and what we traditionally would know as Native Americans.
Now, you've encountered a lot of those same roadblocks, because we talked about how Parker, even today, has been considered a traitor to his people. But you get that same sort of feedback as you're portraying, you're one of them. You're working with them.
Right, and in reality, it's a hard line to walk, because from the native perspective, this is seen as a kind of trait of you're with them, you're okay with this, but why shouldn't I be okay with this? This is reality, and we should be lovingly accepting of all people. It shouldn't just be well, you're this or you're that, and that's what Ely Parker was trying to convey during this time, and what I try to convey during this time is that we shouldn't be looking at what defines us, whether it's through race or ethnicities or through color or through anything that physically would define you, because that's only a certain type of classification, but shouldn't define your actions and how you react to things.
So it's a privilege to be able to be a part of that education, because there's a lot of ignorance surrounding the Native Americans in the Civil War. There's a lot of ignorance surrounding Native Americans today, and I think you're playing a big part in showing the role that Native Americans played, and kind of, you put a lot of yourself into that portrayal. It's very interesting. Now you also portray your own grandfather, so let's talk about that for a minute.
As Ely Parker, yes, I portray my grandfather, Red Jacket, who was the first few chiefs to kind of hold the line between Iroquois and Western world, or the white world. And Red Jacket was so adamant about keeping the Iroquois, or the Haudenosaunee, as they are actually traditionally called, as Iroquois is actually a derogatory term. It's a French term given to the Haudenosaunee. And Haudenosaunee being people of the Longhouse, which is the houses that they had lived in. And that's what is correctly, it's a correct term that is given to the Haudenosaunee.
Because we traditionally think of the Iroquois as sort of British aligned and the Huron as sort of French aligned. But bring us through how, just so we can briefly talk about it, because I think you talk about it when you're Parker as well, is when you're Red Jacket, you talk about how you're on nobody's side. You're not on the American side, you're not on the British side, you're on nobody's side.
And in Red Jacket's terms as well, the only reason, and to explain as well why he's called Red Jacket, is because he's given a British red coat, regimental coat, in which he had adopted the name Red Jacket because that is the definable term of what he had worn for the most period of his life. And that also shows that he had a certain alliance with the British, but for the only reason is to defend his home, which was against the colonials at the time of the Revolution. Yeah. So he was trying to align himself with the British to kind of force the agenda to push away the colonists from taking more than what would be the Iroquois land.
And you've encountered a lot of the same feedback, negative and positive, as when you portray Red Jacket, as you portray Parker, and that's in the season that we shave, because it's 18th century. But now tell us about this medal, because it has that connection with both Red Jacket and Parker.
Yes, the medal that I wear has that connection between both Red Jacket and Ely Parker, because this is the medal that had been passed down from Red Jacket, who was the initial recipient from the gentleman George Washington, you may have heard of him, in 1792. And during that time period, as I'd mentioned previously, that Red Jacket first aligned himself with the British. So why is he accepting a medal now from George Washington? Well, of course, since this is about 30-some years later, he's now kind of changed his tone somewhat, not in the sense that he's more accepting of the Western world, but he is more willing to accept peace over war with his nation, because he does understand that if it is war, his people would be wiped away. So, in accepting this medal, as derogatory as it may look, as derogatory as it may mean, he still accepts the medal as a form of peace in order to keep his people alive and keep the tradition still going within the tribal reservation that is now put. So when that metal gets passed down through the centuries and down to Ely Parker, Parker receives this as a Grand Seika when he's only about 14, 15 years old, as a young gentleman, but showing a new connection between the Western world, this white world, and the Iroquois world, or the Haudenosaunee world, where there can be peace between the two worlds without uh, trying to do land treaties that would diminish certain lands, or creating new or unauthorized land reservations for the Iroquois to shorten the amount of areas that could be either hunted on or even taken by other colonial settlers that would build homes or farmlands and take over these areas, or even just the Western emphasis, such as teaching Christianity. So, but this medal has, and would be the last time it would ever be worn, is by Ely Parker. After Parker's death, he would inevitably give it to the Buffalo Historical Society, in which is where it currently stands, and is a lasting reminder of this initial and hopeful peace between the Western world and the Iroquois.
And you're making your own history with it, because I presume you're the first one to have it reproduced.
Yes, I would.
And it was its own task to get that made.
Yes, this medal, because it has this such an impactful memory and story, and as my portrayal as Red Jacket doesn't get to this point in 1792, it still has this importance that had lasted through Ely Parker, and hopefully and eventually I will be doing presentations as the Commissioner of Native American Affairs, Ely Parker, which is later in the career after the Civil War. And I will be able to talk about this medal and its importance to Native American history, and why that connection between the Western world and not just the Haudenosaunee, but also Native Americans across the U.S. is important to have in preserving the traditions and culture and religion of the Native Americans as a lasting stamp on what is the whole of North America.
So I hope we get to meet Commissioner Parker soon. Can you share with me anything else that has been rewarding for you about portraying this? Because this is just as much a story for Max as it is for Ely.
I'm very grateful to both have you and to have Ken Surface, who plays General Grant, or portrays General Grant, excuse me, to have both of you as mentors to me, because this is new to me still. I'm only about a year in, and that's really young for a portrayal such as this. And then to be brought along with both of you is an eye-opening experience, and I believe it was even told to me it's trial by fire. Yes. Because I'm being thrown into these situations where I need to know the information, and I'm studying as hard as I possibly can to make sure I know about every topic that we may cover. And in reality, it's not as much, but hopefully that will change with the more projects and the more videos that we make, the more talks that I do, will hopefully bring a bigger and better light to both Native Americans and also Ely Parker, to where we can talk a little bit more about the Native American impression that gets left almost in every century. Well, it does get left in every century.
The most rewarding thing for me has been all of the people that say, "Oh, I never knew that." It didn't even come into their mind. And with both of the events that we participate in, I run the Huntington Beach Civil War Days and Huntington Beach the Revolution. We've put in huge on the program, Native Americans in the Civil War, Native Americans in the American Revolution, and it doesn't even, it's not even on anyone's radar. And so just to be able to make people think about that, go home and think about that, go home and research that, I think it's been great to inspire that and prompt the conversation. We're always talking about whether we're making people angry on the internet by prompting those conversations. I don't know, but I think we are advancing that discussion. Yeah. So any other things you want to share on the journey of being Ely, being stuck between two worlds?
I mean, the understanding, for, like you were mentioning, for people who have come up to me and said, "Oh, I didn't know that." I think the biggest shock initially, really, is that Grant had a Native American secretary, a personal secretary of his, that helped write out most of all the writings that had been sent to other officers, and then at the end, signing the official letterheaded terms of the surrender.
Yeah.
And that's one of the biggest eye openers that I get is I never knew that. I thought Grant wrote out the official terms. No,
Yeah.
I had the last term
Yeah.
in writing. So
Yeah.
so it's a big eye opener for a lot of people that did not know that initially, because when you learn it in school, you of course go over all the major topics, and when you hit the surrender for the Civil War, you kind of glance over all the personalities that are there in that room,
Yeah.
all those people, all the lives that they had all individually have lived, not just in the Civil War, but beyond that. And Ely Parker is one of those great stories that gets skipped over just because
Yeah.
it's not one that has an ever, even though to me now, this is an everlasting story for me, but I wish it would be talked about much more often. And even just as a side note or a brief discussion, but a good one, because it's important to know that Native Americans have had an important staple in almost every century of North American history.
Well, I think we couldn't possibly sum it up any more eloquently than that. Thanks for joining us on this discussion of another member of Grant's staff, and uh, thank you for coming out to portray Ely Parker and starting that discussion about Native Americans in American history, because we are all Americans.